2016 was a decade ago. Good lord, that just sounds impossible saying it out loud like that. It still feels like it was only 2 or 3 years ago to me. I know 2016 was a very unpopular year for a lot of people. There were a lot of culturally significant celebrities that had passed away, and it was the beginning of the worst era of American politics that I have lived to see, the consequences of which we are still dealing with to this day. But subjectively, in my own personal experience, it was one of the most important years of my life. Not to sound too pretentious or overly self-important, but it was basically the start of a new era for me and came with a lot of personal growth. It was the year that I started dating the person who is now my wife. It was the first year I was able to take my job into a more professional career direction. And it was the year I rediscovered a lot of old hobbies I hadn't touched in years. 2016 was also, in my personal subjective experience and my own personal tastes, my favorite year in video game releases since then. There hasn't been a year in the decade since that's even come close. Nearly all of my favorite franchises got new entries that year in a variety of different genres, whether it be RPGs, platformers, first-person shooters, and most importantly, immersive sims. So New Year's came and went, and I just got this overwhelming desire to make a 2016 retrospective, just kind of giving my own personal thoughts on all of the major releases that came out that year that I hold near and dear to my heart. A couple things to get out of the way right up front, though. There's a couple games that I know came out in 2016 that are very near and dear to other people that I just don't have a relationship with. I either have never played them or they're just not my kind of genre. So for instance, like Dark Souls 3 or Overwatch, I'm not going to be talking about those at all. Not that I could get footage of the original Overwatch if I wanted to. There's also a huge chunk of games that released in 2016 that I have in my backlog that I just haven't gotten around to playing yet, so I will at least mention those even though they won't get their own dedicated segment. In 2013, I got a 3DS. One of my friends, knowing I was an avid JRPG fan, recommended I pick up Fire Emblem Awakening, as it was her current hyperfixation. This was my introduction to the series, as it was for statistically most people in the West, but through our mutual love of this game, I would fall in love with the series by going back through the older entries. It's the game series my wife and I bonded over when we first started dating, and the community of people I've met through this franchise are some of my best friends and most important people in my life. Fire Emblem Fates was released in North America in February of 2016. Michelle and I had just finished bonding over our love for Awakening and had started dating. I picked up each of us our copies, this being the first and only game in the series to opt for the Pokemon approach of releasing a pair of two alternate versions of the same game. I got her Birthright and Conquest for myself. We played the games to completion relatively quickly compared to how I finish most RPGs with my busy schedule these days, and I remember we did a video discussing our final thoughts on it at the time. So, how do these games hold up a decade later? The greatest descriptor I can think of to sum up Fire Emblem Fates is, these games are frustratingly controversial. As much as I'm grateful to the Fire Emblem community for the wonderful people I have met, this is one of those Nintendo franchises with a bit of a notorious fanbase. I've discussed this in a previous video about how different sects of the fanbase went at each other's throats for which games in the series they liked, with a lot of condescension and elitist gatekeeping thrown at people who had the misfortune of starting the series with Awakening. Not to mention there was a lot of controversy regarding this game's localization, including several changes to the script, the removal of a conversation that could be misinterpreted as a character advocating gay conversion therapy, and the partial removal of what I can only describe as a petting minigame, more or less the same as the one in Pokemon X and Y. Editing me here really quick, chiming in on this segment. I realized the way that line sounded was a little bit ambiguous in terms of how I personally feel about the removal of the whole gay conversion therapy thing, and I just want to make it perfectly clear that I am in favor of this change. I think that there are a lot of people when they look at localization changes to games and other media that they think Japan equals good and that the original way the script was written is always superior no matter what, and I just do not believe that at all. I think from a value standpoint, I wanted to make sure I was perfectly clear that I am in favor of changes that are removing homophobic content from a piece of media. So I just want to make sure I made that clear. This game's reputation went through the tumble dryer a few times prior to release, but then after release, The discourse around this game was extremely annoying. Lots of people were critical of the writing, particularly with the protagonist, but to get into my own personal thoughts about these games, I do agree with some of the criticism levied against it. However, I knew this game would have a bit of a renaissance in the decades since. It has always been my position that the reason people couldn't stop complaining about this game is because it did something evocative that people continue to come back to and think about. In terms of the gameplay mechanics, newer fans and older fans alike praise these games for their complexity and solid design. Conquest in particular is propped up by a lot of older Fire Emblem fans because it does have a more old-school feel with harder maps and a lack of Awakening's quality of life features like not being able to endlessly level grind on random overworld battles. Awakening introduced the ability to pair up two of your allies in battle together to give each other benefits. In Fates, the enemies can do the same, which adds a really interesting layer of challenge. The game has an incredibly unique art style with a beautiful, fantastical world and some incredible character designs. No other Fire Emblem game, hell, no other RPG at all, really looks like this game does. The soundtrack is also incredible and unique as well. I definitely feel like I'm overdue to replay one of these games from the beginning and relive that nostalgia. I personally put these games very middle of the road in terms of my total Fire Emblem series rankings, but that is a much higher praise than it sounds, as I'm generally pretty positive about the whole series. I don't really intend on rehashing a lot of the fan base's more petty complaints about Corrin or the story as a whole, but I will at least go into detail about a complaint I had when I first played the game that I still think about to this day. The dialogue with the support conversations. So in Awakening, the dialogue was mostly good with the writing, as if it feels like it's from some medieval fantasy TV series or something like that. The dialogue in the support conversations here in Fates feels much more jokey and lighthearted, but to the point where nearly every single conversation feels like some kind of bit. It makes it very hard to take the conversation seriously and focus on the developing relationship between the two characters, when every single conversation is framed like a joke. Additionally, the biggest issue with the game's story is how it's delivered to you. I'm all for having multiple routes where the first two are sort of inconclusive non-ends, and the true ending is the third route meant to be completed after the first two. But there's a lot of issues with this model. Firstly, it's kind of greedy. Nintendo is asking you to pay at least $110 for all three routes at the time, with the third one now being essentially lost media thanks to the shutdown of the 3DS eShop. Next is the issue of Revelations is almost unanimously disliked by the community. Out of all the people who I have spoken to in the Fire Emblem community, very few of them have even bothered to play Revelations, and even fewer finished it. And even fewer than that actually enjoyed it. Even after playing 3 different versions of the same game, there are still plot questions that remain unanswered that you need the Revelations DLC to fully unpack. And after jumping through all of those hoops, it's very easy to understand why people would find that unsatisfying. Once again though, I feel like the story for Fire Emblem Fates deserves a lot more credit than it gets, at least for its ambition. I think the sheer amount of story this game has over its predecessors is exactly what opened it up to the level of scrutiny it receives from fans, ironically enough. But if the story of Fire Emblem Fates is only like a 6.5 out of 10 at best, the gameplay is an easily solid 9, especially in Conquest. Even though the multi-route method was more or less improved upon in Three Houses, if there's one thing that can be made evident about the Fire Emblem series in the decades since this game, is if you don't like what they did with a particular game, don't worry about it because the next one will be completely different, for better or for worse.
I'm willing to take full responsibility for the horrible events of the last 24 hours, but you must understand. Our interest in their world was purely for the betterment of mankind. Everything has clearly gotten out of hand now, yes. But it was worth the risk, I assure you.
I've always had a bit of imposter syndrome being an id Software fan, considering I was born the year that Doom released. I didn't discover Doom and its other brands until I was 16 and got an Xbox 360. The backwards compatible system let me play the Doom 3 Collector's Edition, which included a port of Doom 1 and 2 for the Xbox. I also played Quake 4, which included a free port of Quake 2. By 2011, I had completed most of id Software's catalog as well as lots of other games made with their technology, and I was just in time to pick up their first new IP since the 90s on launch. I really enjoyed Rage, probably a lot more than most people, so much so that I'm planning an entire video on why I deeply enjoy this game despite of its unpopular consensus. Little did I know that in the 20-teens, id's most iconic brands would be reimagined in ways I couldn't have possibly dreamed of when I was only 16 becoming a fan. id Tech 5 that was used to power Rage was used to make Wolfenstein: The New Order by Machine Games, which ended up being my favorite game of 2014. But as much as I enjoyed that game, I couldn't escape the allure of the teaser on the box. Get access to the limited closed alpha for the new Doom. I was hyped for this. I don't know if the new Doom had even been properly announced prior to this, but I knew it was only a few short years away. It finally released in May of 2016 and blew everyone's highest expectations away. Depending on the day of the week you ask me, Doom 2016 might be my favorite id game, but it is without a doubt my favorite game of 2016, and that is saying a lot, because as you will see, it is up against some incredibly steep competition. Lots of people were starting to turn their back on Doom 3's slower, more survival horror-focused approach to the series, so this game was a breath of fresh air to them, going the complete opposite direction. This game was all about bombastic, over-the-top nonsense, and an ironic, self-aware throwback to what made the series great, while also innovating in a lot of really clever ways. The gameplay is extremely fast-paced, the game encourages an aggressive playstyle where you have to constantly keep moving and piling on the damage onto enemies. Cowering behind cover is not the way to play this game at all. You're encouraged to be as aggressive as possible, mostly due to the glory kill system where an enemy's low on health, you can execute them with a quick and flashy melee animation that causes them to drop health pickups so you can get back into the fight. That combined with the verticality of levels, the best first-person platforming I've seen in a game outside of Metroid Prime, the enemy and weapon variety and fixed encounters like gore nests, and weapons having 2 alternate fire modes that can be unlocked, this game is some of the most cathartic and satisfying fun you could have in any shooter. But I'm not really saying anything that hasn't already been said before. This game left a serious lasting impression on players. It has a die-hard community, it was used as a benchmark performance test kind of game for PC specifications. The iconic soundtrack by Mick Gordon, I kid you not, was adored by metal fans who had never even played the game. It even has a decent story, a better one than any previous Doom game, or really most id Software games in general. It's a self-aware story that doesn't really take itself too seriously out of respect for the series' origins, and invites you to disregard the specifics of the lore, with a protagonist who has nothing but contempt for the situation he's in. The lack of giving a fuck by the protagonist being a more endearing quality of this silent protagonist than the majority of FPS protagonists that are fully voiced. I feel like this game is simultaneously both in the spirit of and the complete antithesis of that famous quote from John Carmack about video game stories. This game's success spawned a new era of cultural relevance for Doom, an entire trilogy of new games. While I've heard a lot of people say that Doom Eternal renders this game completely obsolete, I actually couldn't disagree more. I love Doom Eternal as well, but I very much feel the same way about these two games as I do about the original Doom 1 and 2. Doom 2 and also Doom Eternal are much more intense, complex, demanding experiences than their predecessors, and sometimes it can just be overwhelming and overstimulating to have to keep up with the challenge of the mechanics or the level design in those games, and sometimes I prefer a more focused, simplistic game. So I will always come back to this game and Doom 1 by extension and love it just as much as I did a decade ago, regardless of how good Eternal and Dark Ages are, or how much they've changed the conventions of the genre. Very much how, in spite of my borrowed nostalgia, I have no problem speaking to the objective quality of the original Doom. I've only played Doom 2016 from beginning to end about 3 times, and that only goes to show, for one, just how big of a game's backlog I have, but also, 2, just how busy an adult life can be that in a decade since, I feel like I've barely had time to revisit this game and really master it. This will be a reoccurring trend in this video, and part of me wishes I could be stranded on a desert island with electricity and only the games that appear in this video, and I guarantee you I would never get tired of them all.
The promise of a golden age is over.
In 2011, I had never heard the term immersive sim before, if it had even been coined at the time. Nor did I know much of anything about the Deus Ex brand, aside from some vague cyberpunk themes, and that it was a very mechanically complex FPS RPG hybrid. I knew that BioShock styled itself as an FPS RPG hybrid, and that was one of my favorite games at the time. So when I started hearing news and watching reviews for Deus Ex Human Revolution, it definitely piqued my interest. I got it for Christmas that year, and sandwiched between playing a level here and there of Halo Anniversary and GoldenEye Reloaded, Human Revolution would end up being my favorite game of 2011. I played the game easily 5 times over and made my own Let's Play series of it. It was a very accessible gateway drug into the rest of the immersive sim genre. I tracked down the PS2 version of the original game as well as System Shock 2 on Steam for my Mac. One thing I need you guys to keep in mind when it comes to this discussion about immersive sims is much like the discussion around Doom and boomer shooters in general, I admit to having a bit of imposter syndrome because I've never really been a PC gamer. I played games on PC when I was a very young kid, but after my brother got a PS2 in 2003, it's pretty much been consoles ever since. I've never had a gaming PC rig, and I unfortunately committed to using a Mac for video editing back in 2011, and I've been stuck with that decision ever since until getting a Steam Deck in the summer of 2025. I know that immersive sims are a genre typically designed for PC in mind, especially the original Thief, Deus Ex, and System Shock games. But my exposure to this franchise started out on console, and it's too late for me to go back in time and change that. So even though it took me until this year to finally play the PC version of Deus Ex to completion, it remains a franchise I hold near and dear to my heart. So, in 2016, a full 5 years after Human Revolution, when we finally got a continuation of that game in the form of Deus Ex Mankind Divided, I was completely overjoyed with excitement. So how did this game end up holding up as a follow-up to one of my favorite games of the 7th gen in my early adulthood? Mankind Divided had a very difficult task in following up Human Revolution, a game that sold more than any other entry in the Deus Ex franchise by a huge margin, and Square Enix placed some very lofty and frankly unfair expectations on its sequel, in spite of the fact that it's always been a niche franchise. In terms of the visuals, in spite of the fact that Human Revolution's graphics were more impressive from a style and art direction standpoint, Mankind Divided ends up being one of the most gorgeous games of the 8th generation, and was pretty technically demanding for its time. Huge leaps in terms of visuals. I've played this game on the original base model Xbox One, a PS4 Pro on a 4K TV with high frame rate, on my 2019 iMac with 32 gigs of RAM, and sadly I don't think the graphics card is good enough to handle that game in that instance, as it did stutter a bit, and I've also played it on the Steam Deck. It's definitely one of those 8th gen console games that benefits from the performance upgrades of the Pro models of those consoles, but it overall performs fine aside from some long loading screens on the base model consoles. Obviously, modern PCs can push this game further beyond anything the consoles ever could dream possible, but this is something that's never really been my realm of expertise and probably never will. It's just not something that interests me when it comes to video games. But this discussion about PC specifications and whatnot does apply also to Doom and the next game we're going to be talking about, so consider this section sort of a catch-all for that. In terms of the gameplay, I can't fully speak to it as well as I would like to. Most of the time with these immersive sim games, I don't feel like I really have a handle on them until I've played them about 4 times. With Human Revolution, I've probably played it close to 10 times now at this point, but Mankind Divided I've only played from beginning to end twice. So lots of the more nuanced things, like the new hidden augs for Jensen that help facilitate a more stealth or a more combat playstyle, I just haven't had the time to fully explore. Overall, the tools they give you do make huge improvements to the existing mechanics in Human Revolution, including a better stealth and non-lethal options, but also the shooting feels drastically improved as well. I personally really enjoy the way the shooting feels in Human Revolution, but by the standards of shooters at that time, a lot of people complained about it feeling either jank or outdated. Even though these games should never really be directly compared to shooters, you know people are going to do so anyway. Here in Mankind Divided, the weapon feedback goes from being just barely above average to exceptional, and definitely gives the game some solid ground to compete against other games where shooting is the only thing you do. The game has a similar formula to the previous one, with a city hub where you can explore and do side quests. Prague being an absolutely beautiful city in this game. The side quests as well are, in my opinion, one of the strongest features of this game and one of the most impressive standout improvements over the previous game. The side missions will always spiderweb out of control in a million different directions, with additional objectives being added and side quests that will lead into other side quests. It's really cool and well thought out. My biggest problem with the game, however, is the main plot. Human Revolution tried to make the game's moral and ethical conflicts ambiguous enough to where the player could decide how they felt about them on their own. Not to mention, Adam Jensen as a character with his own agency, not formed directly by player choice, had a more neutral position in the ethical debate about augmentations given his circumstances. But due to the endings of the previous game, the state of the world in Mankind Divided is not ambiguous at all. Augmented people are treated as second-class citizens in Prague, as well as other places around the world. We basically instituted a new form of segregation overnight following the events of Human Revolution, and it severely complicates the implications of the world of this series. To me, I also think it misses the mark on some of the political and social commentary, because the real-world parallels that it draws comparison to just kind of further demonstrate how ridiculous the augmentation segregation stuff is, and it feels a little tone-deaf. The game tries to create scenarios with different organizations and alliances where you don't know who to trust, just like in the previous games, but it just feels a lot less interesting. I was so much less invested in the main plot of this game compared to Human Revolution, and after the ending where the credits roll, I just feel like we didn't really accomplish very much. They probably expected this game to be part 2 of a trilogy, but because Square Enix demanded that the game sell 6 million copies, or it otherwise be considered a financial failure and its follow-up would not be greenlit. We will never know what that follow-up would have been like. This is a topic I'm deeply passionate about and am quite frustrated with, as I've talked about in other videos. Wow, okay, we're going to add a little unscripted part in here because I almost forgot to talk about this. So Square Enix being at the helm of the Deus Ex franchise was the worst thing to ever happen to it, because they shoehorned in so much corporate greed and so much appeal to mainstream nonsense into this otherwise niche genre that it was destined to fail. They did this thing with Mankind Divided called Augment Your Pre-Order, which was basically, there was a planned 5 tiers of unlockable bonuses you would get for pre-ordering the game, and if enough people pre-ordered them, then it would gradually unlock the next tier of bonuses that everyone would collectively get. Sort of like backing a Kickstarter, where the percentage of people that backs it unlocks new rewards for everyone backing it. But just think about how soulless and greedy that is, because you're basically just like, yeah, this multi-million-dollar AAA game, we're going to demand that the devs take 5 different tiers of content either out of the game or try to find some stupid bullshit thing to give us, and we're going to dangle that in front of you like a carrot so you'll pre-order it so we can justify all of our marketing costs and things like that. And this is why we can't have immersive sims anymore, is stuff like this. The expectations from Square Enix for Mankind Divided to sell was absolutely ridiculous and completely unrealistic. And the Augment Your Pre-Order thing was met with so much backlash that they canceled it, and they delayed the game again. The game was originally supposed to release in February of 2016, and it came out much later that year. It was September or October or something like that. I don't even remember if I knew that the original Dishonored was going to be an immersive sim style game and I was looking forward to it. I think I was just really in love with the visual aesthetic and wanted to take a chance and fall in love with a new IP. Boy, did that pay off. Dishonored was not only my favorite game of 2012, but is also, gun to my head, my favorite immersive sim. I'll probably do a stream one day where I rank order each of the ones I've played. Back in 2012, and most of the years since, I had about an equal love and respect for BioShock, Deus Ex Human Revolution, and Dishonored, but upon recent evaluation after replaying all of these games with my wife and our friends, I can confidently say that Dishonored edges them out ever so slightly, and doesn't have some of the same flaws that the more console-centric designs of the other games impose on the immersive sim genre. I'm assuming we can thank Harvey Smith for this, as Dishonored honestly has more in common with the original Deus Ex than Human Revolution does, if you think about the level design, the way that resources are implemented, and NPC characters are utilized. If Human Revolution was disappointing to you because of how different it was from the original Deus Ex, Dishonored should more than scratch that itch. Ironically enough, considering it's more of a love letter to the Thief games. So after doing the prerequisite immersive sim thing of ungracefully stumbling through my first incompetent playthrough of Dishonored, I completed 4 additional playthroughs and finally mastered the game's level design and mechanics. I was hooked and definitely wanted more of this experience. I bought the Dunwall Archives book, I made a cosplay of Corvo that I took to conventions starting in 2014, and meeting other people who really resonated with this game, some of whom went on to leave their mark on the franchise itself permanently. You know who you are. We were all waiting in anticipation for news about a sequel. Who remembers the Darkness of Tivia fake leak? In 2016, we finally got Dishonored 2. Man, there is never going to be a year in video games ever again where I'm going to feel this spoiled. A sequel to Dishonored, Deus Ex Human Revolution, and a new Doom all in the same year? I barely had time to play it all. So how does Dishonored 2 hold up? It's like 95% as good as the first game. My biggest challenge in forming my opinion about Dishonored 2 is similar to Mankind Divided. Even though I've played it about 3.5 times now, I still don't feel like I've even come close to uncovering all of its secrets, unlike the first game where I feel like I've explored it pretty thoroughly. Doing a sequel to Dishonored comes with a lot of the same issues as a sequel to the original Deus Ex. It's a game that heavily relies on player freedom and choice with multiple different endings. So how can you possibly follow up and account for all of these different things? A lot of the things that were ambiguous in the first game have now been canonized, which undercuts some of the weight of your choices from the first game, but it's not as big of a deal as it sounds. The game taking place 15 years later and having Emily be a playable character this time around was an incredible choice and probably the most natural direction for the series to take. Corvo this time around is no longer a silent protagonist, and is instead voiced by Stephen Russell, the voice of Garrett from Thief, which is a nice little reference. He does a great job, but it removes some of the mystique and ambiguity of his character, and ends up canonizing him in a particular writing style. Granted, it's a style that I like a lot. In terms of gameplay, the individual levels of this game are an incredible evolution from the first game's formula with some awesome gimmicks. All of your targets in the first game you either killed, or found a non-lethal way to neutralize them purely on principle, because you felt like killing them would be wrong. But in some cases, the non-lethal outcomes were still extremely cruel. Having the Pendletons mutilated and sold into slave labor in their own mines, sending Lady Boyle off in the hostage captivity of her romantic stalker. It's fucked up no matter how you look at it. But in this game, the non-lethal options can sometimes convert that character into an ally, in the case of Hypatia and Stilton. This comes with the caveat of, I really couldn't tell you what even changes in this game between high and low chaos compared to the previous game. One of the foundational gameplay mechanics that was used in the marketing of the first game feels very understated in this game. So the decision to kill or not kill the target characters in this game feels more motivated just by the intrinsic value of having succeeded at doing it, rather than an extrinsic reward that the game gives you for picking one choice over the other. The gimmicks of each level manage to have a level of spectacle never before seen in an immersive sim genre, while still not creating an experience that puts you on rails or holds your hand too much. Jindosh's Clockwork Mansion, or the time travel mechanic in A Crack in the Slab, are some of the most impressively designed levels I've ever seen in a game like this. My only real gripe with this game is a petty one, and that is the central conflict. I like Delilah as a character, I think she works really well, but using her as the villain again undercuts a lot of what happened in the DLC for the first game. This game does invite you to be sympathetic to Delilah, and positions Emily as needing to be humbled by her experience of fleeing to Karnaca to take back her empire. It's a nice twist on these characters, but I think what I had envisioned in my head when the trailers for this game first started coming out is I almost wish that Emily and Corvo were on an adventure together working alongside each other, where their mission briefings could have actual dialogue and banter between them, and you could choose which character you wanted to play as in each mission based on whose powers would be better suited to that level. But in reality, once you pick one of the two characters, the other one is placed in stone for the rest of the game and left with no dialogue or interactions until the credits. It feels like a huge shame and missed opportunity. But there's still plenty of Dishonored supplementary material out there, and I've been really enjoying the banter between Emily and Corvo in the books. Overall, Dishonored 2 is incredible. It's every bit as good as the original, but much like Mankind Divided, suffered from the challenges in marketing immersive sims to mainstream audiences. We may not have another era of mainstream big-budget immersive sims like we had back in 2016 ever again. As if 2016 couldn't get any better, one of my other highlights of this year was adding a brand new console to my library. To this day, the PlayStation Vita is one of my favorite niche consoles to collect for, and picking up all the games I own for it was one of the most fun experiences I've had as a collector. I picked up the Vita at pretty much the perfect time to become a collector for it. This was after the handheld was widely considered a flop by the mainstream, during the point where the games were still getting localized and released, but before the console and its games became really expensive and rare during the post-COVID collector boom I talked about in another video. In 2016, the Vita was still getting plenty of first-party support, but most of the games being made for it were niche genres. Long gone were the days of Need for Speed and Assassin's Creed getting Vita-exclusive entries. This was the era of localizations of visual novels, lots of which were of the otome variety, JRPGs, Musou games, and obscure Japanese action games and puzzle games. One of the studios keeping the lights on for the Vita was Nippon Ichi Software of America, or NISA. You may know Nippon Ichi as the developers of the Disgaea games, but at the time they also acted as the publisher for Spike Chunsoft games like Danganronpa and Falcom games like Ys. So when it came time to picking up the collector's editions for games like Ys 8, I had to order directly from the NISA website, and this would be my primary way of picking up new Vita titles during this era. Sometimes I would pick up games on a whim if I thought they looked interesting or unique, and that's how we arrive at Yomawari Night Alone, a top-down survival horror game set in a fantasy version of Japan where yokai and other aspects of the Shinto mythology are real. So, what do I think of this game? First of all, I think it's worth pointing out that when it comes to survival horror, I don't really go here. I'm not a connoisseur of the genre, and I haven't played a lot of the most iconic titles. Horror is one of those genres, whether it be games or movies or even books or music, where people can be absolutely ravenous about it. There are certain people who are massive horror enthusiasts, as if it's the only genre they consume, and I feel extremely under-equipped to talk about horror, lacking those qualifications. There's a chance that this game is not highly regarded amongst horror game enjoyers, but you know what? I enjoy this game quite a bit for what it is, and I do so without the approval of anyone else but myself. Yomawari has us taking control of a young girl living in a rural part of Japan. She bravely ventures out on her own into the night to investigate a series of tragic events with an understanding that hostile spirits of all varieties appear at night and represent danger all throughout this town. I won't speak too much about the story for spoiler reasons, but it's a very simplistic, straightforward story that is very tragic in nature. There's something undeniably charming about the simplicity of this game. Simple sprites, very little dialogue or direct story beats, and gameplay that only uses a few buttons and a few simple mechanics. As expected with a game like this, you cannot fight enemies. You simply have to avoid the various different kinds of spirits in the game, of which there are seemingly dozens of different kinds, all with their own unique behavior and patterns for how to avoid them. This game has a forgiving save system with the Chizo statues throughout the city, but even backtracking through an area you've been to before can be extremely tense, since if you know there is a difficult enemy in that area, contact with any of the spirits is instant death, and while I wouldn't consider this game very difficult, you will absolutely be retrying certain sections again and again as you learn how to avoid the spirits. One of the standout things about this game that drew me to it is the art direction. The design and style of some of these monsters is downright mind-blowing in how uniquely grotesque and memorable they are. I have extremely fond memories of lying in bed in complete darkness with my Vita pressed up to my face playing this, and that is a level of immersion that definitely makes this one of my most memorable experiences of 2016. This game was successful enough to become an entire trilogy, with Yomawari Midnight Shadows, which I also own for the Vita, and finally Yomawari Lost in the Dark on the PS4, and I would love to do a full series retrospective on this trilogy as its own set of videos one day. Back in 2007, a rivalry as petty, pointless, and vitriolic as the very console wars themselves took place between Halo 3 and Call of Duty 4. This discourse felt strange to me at the time because prior to Call of Duty 4, The Call of Duty series was popular, but I never would have guessed it would have transformed overnight from merely being a popular video game franchise to the video game franchise. The success of the 7th generation's Call of Duty games are no doubt responsible for some of the extremely bloated expectations of success that publishers still put on modern AAA games to this day. But I was never really that much of a fan. The only Call of Duty games I have played are 2005's Call of Duty 2, 2007's Modern Warfare, 2010's Black Ops 1, and 2016's Infinite Warfare, just to put my finger on the pulse every once in a while, and just to kind of check in with this franchise as sort of a cultural curiosity. These types of linear cinematic shooters try very hard to keep you within the guardrails, and very much do not want you to do anything that is not explicitly developer intended. The hand-holding nature of these games became pervasive among other action games in this era. Most people know the story of how, in 2010, due to internal conflicts, some of the founding members of Infinity Ward split off to form their own studio, the cleverly titled Respawn Entertainment, their first game being Titanfall in 2013. Most people were expecting Titanfall to just be a sci-fi Call of Duty with mech suits, but it really pushed the design of multiplayer shooters ahead by a few years, and really mainstreamed a lot of the mechanics that are popular in the genre to this day. I think I only played the original Titanfall all of one time. The game lacked an actual single-player campaign, and the way the story was given to you was just through like audio conversations and lore dumps on the multiplayer maps, and it was just a convoluted mess of a way to tell a story. So when Titanfall 2 released in 2016, I initially just kind of shrugged and moved on, but then I heard people saying that not only did they go all out for Titanfall 2's single-player campaign, but it is a massive design departure from the Call of Duty series, and it was actually one of the best single-player campaigns in a first-person shooter in years. After playing it myself, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that those claims are true. Titanfall 2's campaign is fantastic. It has beautiful and varied environments, a compelling story, incredibly unique and visually interesting set pieces, like the one where you go through the assembly area for that arena thing, where the fact that this game coincidentally has the same time travel gimmick as Dishonored 2, just implemented differently. There's this uncharacteristically bombastic and over-the-top nature to it when it comes to the boss battles. They remind me of Metal Gear villains, frankly. I think this game is best appreciated when juxtaposed against Call of Duty, though. I played 2016's Infinite Warfare for the first time last year in 2025, mostly as a curiosity and as a point of comparison for Titanfall 2 here. And it's remarkable how similar this game feels compared to its previous entries. Every Call of Duty game tries to implement a new feature here and there, but most of the time they end up being gimmicks that don't feature heavily in the game. In terms of the tactile feeling of how Infinite Warfare feels to control, it feels exactly the same as the old Call of Duties, and it still keeps you on a rigidly narrow path and nags you relentlessly for trying to stray from it. Infinite Warfare is still a pretty decent single-player campaign that takes itself much more seriously than any of the recent games do from what I hear, but it still doesn't hold a candle to Titanfall 2. As a point of comparison, there's a really cool mission in Infinite Warfare where you're on Saturn's moon Titan, and you're infiltrating behind enemy lines through a storm. You have to carefully follow your NPC allies and go exactly where they tell you to go or you die. Compare that to how stealth is done in Titanfall 2. You have open-ended sandbox encounters where you are by yourself with your own personal cloaking system, and you can decide for yourself how you want to handle enemies. Even when it comes to when and where you fight in the Titan or on foot as a pilot, there are many times throughout the game where you can enter and exit the Titan at will, and the game doesn't penalize you for how you want to play. The Titan combat is integrated so well into the game, and the controls are extremely tight. Titan-on-Titan battles are just awesome, and I cannot recommend this game highly enough to people who are fans of mecha. And nothing will ever top the doomed bromance between Matt Mercer and his giant robot friend. As a kid born in the early 90s, Pokemon was a massive part of my childhood, as it was for most people my age. I remember in 98 and 99 looking forward to 3 p.m. every day for when the anime would come on TV. I remember opening packs of the original base set of the TCG, and I remember going to see the very first movie in theaters. Pokemon was an absolute phenomenon. Every single kid in my neighborhood had the cards and the Game Boy games. I played quite a bit of Gen 1, it was technically my first experience with a turn-based RPG. I actually was a little bit slow on the uptake getting into Gen 2. As a kid, I didn't really care for the designs at first, and I largely blame this one issue of the Beckett Pokemon Collector magazine for their terrible art and early translations of the Gen 2 Pokemon for turning me off from that game initially. We had to borrow Silver from a neighborhood kid and rent it from Blockbuster before my brother and I would eventually get our own copies of Gold and Crystal respectively in 2002. But afterwards, I would play the ever-living hell out of Gen 2, probably putting about 200 or 300 hours into that game, but I never got a Game Boy Advance as a kid. Instead, my brother got a PS2 in 2003, and the trajectory of video game exposure for me changed forever. It wasn't until 2012, when I was already an adult, when I would play a Pokemon game again. A girl I was interested in at the time insisted that I pick up a DS and Black and White 2 to trade and battle with her, which I thoroughly enjoyed and probably considered my favorite Pokemon game to this day. Her and I were dating when X and Y came out, but broke up shortly afterwards. Then in 2016, when Michelle and I started dating, she got me back into Pokemon again in anticipation for Sun and Moon to release that year. We picked up Sun and Moon on release just like Fire Emblem, and played them to completion more or less side by side. But after beating the Elite Four and watching the credits roll, I sadly have barely touched Sun and Moon since then, and I can hardly recall much of anything from that playthrough, to be honest. I think the main issue is that I played so much Pokemon that year. All within that year, I replayed Red version as a digital download on the 3DS, finished Heart Gold, finished Y literally the day before Sun and Moon dropped, and then immediately started playing Moon. I was probably a bit burned out by the time I finished this game, as you can probably pick up from my track record for the series. I'm not really a capital F fan of Pokemon. I like this series well enough, but lots of people I know play this series like it's a second job. No disrespect to those people, but I can't imagine putting hundreds and hundreds of hours into one of these games nowadays. I just have so many other JRPGs I would rather play. I have zero interest in competitive battling or shiny hunting or anything like that. But to talk about the merits of Sun and Moon, while I enjoyed X and Y well enough, it felt very safe. Almost like a franchise reboot for a younger generation whose first console was a 3DS. That game felt very easy and had lots of nostalgia pandering from previous generations. So with Sun and Moon, in spite of being on the same engine, it felt like a very distinctly different feeling game. One of the most innovative games in the franchise up to that point. So many features or themes were changed from previous entries. HM moves were rendered obsolete with the rideable Pokemon. They introduced regional variants of existing Pokemon, which were hilarious and really clever. It was the first time the series had boss battle style Pokemon, essentially throwing out the gyms and badges formula from previous games and taking a chance on something new. Also, I really loved the idea that you, the player, had a hand in creating the Pokemon League for this region, and the final battle is not you trying to become the champion. You are the champion already, and a challenger is trying to take that title from you. How awesome is that? I also really love the heavily Hawaiian-inspired aesthetic of the game. What's tragic about Sun and Moon, though, is it's likely the last new Pokemon game that I will play. I didn't pick up Ultra Sun and Moon, but Michelle did and had a lot of complaints with it. In her words, it felt lazy. It was too similar to the first version of the game, and the things that were changed with the story were frankly changed for the worse. There's a huge number of people who are dissatisfied with the Switch era of Pokemon games, either because they took the series into a direction they didn't personally like, or because the games felt really poor quality in terms of visual fidelity and performance stability. There's also a subset of people who have a ton of problems with the Switch era of Pokemon games, in spite of having put hundreds if not thousands of hours into them. The cognitive dissonance here always makes me scratch my head. There are people that pay full price and spend hundreds of hours playing a game that they have nothing but negative things to say about. For me, this is a rabbit hole that I have zero interest in diving into, and a community that I have no interest in being a part of. I've already complained about Pokemon as a brand in the game collecting video, and my impression of the series has only gotten worse since then. I mean no disrespect to those who play Pokemon as one of their main hobbies, but I wish to proudly remain a very casual fan, and with that I will probably sooner replay Sun and Moon than move forward with the franchise at this point. I'm about to say some very negative things about Final Fantasy XV, so if you're the type of person that can't stand a dissenting opinion about a video game you like, maybe just don't watch this part. I don't hate this game. In fact, I think the total package is actually pretty good. I know saying something is better than the sum of its parts gets said too much these days, but it really does apply well to this game. Each element of the game in isolation is frankly pretty mediocre, but it all combines into this absolutely beautiful experience that just leaves you crying at the end, thinking back about this incredible journey you went on with these characters. There are a lot of things about this game that I do like. It's visually extremely pretty with impressive graphics, a great day-to-night cycle, and some seriously incredible dynamic character animations. The amount of unique things your character can do and how they interact with their environment, enemies, and each other still makes this game look state-of-the-art and cutting edge even a decade later. It's also hard not to appreciate how charming the bond is between these four characters. They play off of each other extremely well, and they act like people who have been friends for a very long time would act. But there's always a catch, isn't there? Before I say anything else, let me just reassure you that Final Fantasy is my #1 favorite media franchise of all time. Above all of the media I consume across all genres, I keep Final Fantasy closer to my heart than anything else, and as most fans can tell you, every single game in the series is someone's favorite, and every single game in the series is someone's most hated, and the proper way to engage in that discourse is just to agree to disagree. You're not going to change anyone's mind. So on that note, for the aspects of the game that I dislike, some of them are directly related to the game itself in a vacuum, and others are more related to the creation of the game itself. And before you jump to conclusions, no, I don't give a shit about the Versus 13 thing. I feel like people look at the ways in which the early builds of the game are different from the finished product, and assume that it was necessarily better before, when we have no evidence that those things would have made the finished product any better. Some people talk like the Versus 13 they imagine in their head as a finished game that Square is just keeping in a drawer filed away somewhere, away from them in specific. But in reality, the reasons for why Versus 13 became 15 and how the development of this game went through the tumble dryer is part of the reason why I dislike this final iteration of the game. This game is not the result of a decade-long passion project where progress was meticulously built upon. This is the result of the dev team getting a yard ahead and Tetsuya Nomura moving the goal line to the other side of the field. Countless builds of this game were scrapped and discarded, even up to and including after the rebrand to 15. Years and years of wasted, discarded effort on a project that was most definitely an absolute living hell to work on. I can only assume that some of my gripes with the main game are a result of this. The shockingly inconsistent world building, the shoehorned in open world that doesn't really enhance the gameplay and was most likely there to appease the people who complained about the linearity of 13, the jank of some of the combat or how you can literally just hold circle to win fights, or the fact that they tried to retcon the story and plug in missing pieces with paid DLC or a second version of the game. It makes me feel like they knew the vanilla version of this game was unfinished, and they were going to have to patchwork the story together in a more finished state with DLC. This is also the era that Square Enix transformed into their final, most evil corporate form. Square was making, and still continues to make to this day, some of the most soulless, greediest decisions I've ever seen, and I basically have zero confidence in them when it comes to handling my favorite franchises anymore. We already talked about the living hell that was the making and marketing of Deus Ex, and the whole augment your pre-order scandal, but this was also the era that we saw collector's editions of Final Fantasy XV, Nier Automata, and Dragon Quest XI shoot up to $250 and only be sold through the Square Enix online store. Not to mention all the terrible one-and-done Final Fantasy phone games being made around this time. Final Fantasy XV was this multimedia project that was heavily exploitative of the series' reputation and fans' brand loyalty. Why should I have to watch an anime miniseries to get the backstory on the main boys? Why should I have to watch an entirely separate CGI movie to understand one of the most important events in the story that changes the entire status quo of the game world? And who could forget the tacky cup noodle cross-promotion thing and how weird that was? On one hand, it's kind of a funny meme, and on the other hand, I really just don't appreciate seeing a real-world product being advertised in a game with fantasy literally in the title. And also, regarding the multimedia thing, even though some people defend those other works and say they're fine, and in fact I really enjoyed Kingsglaive for what it's worth, Final Fantasy XVI, which now exists, is proof positive that you don't need a multimedia project for the game to have a complete story. Also, I just need to get this petty gripe out of the way because I feel very strongly about it. Even though the four party characters are great and their relationships are some of the best part of this game, Having a cast of only 4 characters is a pretty huge letdown. It's the first time since Final Fantasy III we've had a party that small, and it's seriously lacking in diversity. I much prefer the Final Fantasy games where the cast has some women and other races included as opposed to just 4 fashion models. Where's your Tifa, your Yuna, your Lightning? Where's your Red 13, your Kumari, or your Freya? Again, just to reiterate, I don't hate this game. I think it's overall pretty decent, but you can't separate it from the context it was created within. Art is never created nor experienced in a vacuum, and context always matters. I personally rank this game pretty close to the bottom in terms of my personal rankings for the Final Fantasy mainline series, but that isn't the damning condemnation that it sounds like. It means this game is still pretty good, there's just like 11 games I'd prefer over it. As I said in the Yomawari section, I do enjoy a variety of genres of video games. Even though I definitely tend to gravitate towards RPGs and shooters, particularly in the intersection of immersive sims therein, I'm much more of an enthusiast for those genres, but that doesn't mean I don't at least enjoy others. You can name pretty much any kind of video game genre under the sun, and I'm definitely at least willing to give it a try. For instance, I do enjoy a side-scrolling platformer every once in a while, and even though admittedly I'm not particularly good at a lot of the classic ones. People that have a fondness for the NES era of games tend to be people of a certain temperament, or they grew up on it and are accustomed to the level of challenge and lack of modern quality of life features. I, on the other hand, would love to get more into series like Mega Man or Castlevania, but ultimately it took the built-in save state feature of the Castlevania Legacy Collection for me to be able to beat the first game genuinely, a task I was never able to do over the years on the original NES cart. Another Vita game I picked up in 2016 was the delightfully charming and colorful Shantae Half-Genie Hero. I don't remember if I knew about Shantae's origins as a franchise prior to picking this up, but let's go ahead and cover it regardless. Shantae was originally a side-scrolling platformer developed for the Game Boy Color in 2002 by WayForward. The title character is the creation of the husband and wife duo of Matt and Aaron Bozon. Shantae, her design being created by Aaron, and the game being programmed by Matt. The original game is certainly a hidden gem on the Game Boy Color, but sold poorly due to the GBA having already released at the time. It became a bit of a cult classic as well as one of the rarest and most expensive games on the Game Boy Color. It was nearly a decade later when the series got a second chance at life, and the second and third games came soon after one another. Half-Genie Hero was crowdfunded and released in 2016 as the 4th game in the series, but can almost be seen as a reboot of the series and is a great starting point for new players. The game has a beautiful, colorful, cartoonish aesthetic. It was very refreshing and unique for its time. Shantae, as a half-genie, has taken on the role of the guardian genie of Sequin Land, and aims to protect it from the semi-regular attacks of the suspiciously purple pirate captain Risky Boots, using her magic dancing powers to transform into various different animal forms used in platforming and combat. It has a nice quality of life features, and while the spirit of the challenge of the NES era of platformers is alive and well, it doesn't feel nearly as punishing due to a modern save system and health restoration items and other such quality of life features. The gameplay is overall extremely solid. All of the transformations are useful and interesting, and Shantae has a variety of offhand weapons and spells in the vein of Castlevania. The story of these games is never usually anything to write home about, but the big appeal is that the game is self-aware that it exists in an era of nostalgia-driven throwback games. It doesn't take itself the slightest bit seriously, and the writing is very meta and full of fourth-wall jokes. Half-Genie Hero is probably the perfect entry point into the series in terms of story, gameplay, platform availability, and general accessibility. But once you've dipped your toes in with this game, the rest of the franchise has a lot to offer. The 5th Shantae, Seven Sirens, released in late 2020, and was one of the first new games that I finished after moving into my new house at the time. It's a full-on Metroidvania, and a damn good one at that. The developers even made a sort of Shantae 1.5 game just last year that ended up being a physically released GBA reproduction card, and it's also really good. We're in an era now where deliberately retro, nostalgia-fueled indie games are a powerhouse genre within gaming. Indie games with retro graphics are often the most popular games of any particular year, typically because they don't have a lot of the issues that plague modern AAA games. Shantae's place in pop culture is weird. Like, people clearly like the series a lot, and maybe I'm just not online enough to really have a finger on the pulse, but it doesn't really seem like the series is as popular as something like Hollow Knight, for instance. But I do hope the franchise continues to grow, and I hope fans of side-scrollers and Metroidvanias hold the series in as high regard alongside those other greats of the genre. Another awesome thing about 2016 is there are a ton more incredible games released that year that I haven't gotten around to beating yet, so this year still has a lot more potential just waiting for me in my backlog. Also, 2016 coincidentally contained a plethora of remasters and re-releases, some of which happen to be some of my favorite games of all time. Now, unfortunately, there's another category of games I had to exclude from this video, which include games that released in Japan, but wouldn't come to the US until 2017. So unfortunately, due to that rule, I cannot talk about Persona 5, Tales of Berseria, or my beloved Fate Extella, although I did technically play that on the Japanese version in 2016, but that game also got its own dedicated video. Maybe I can do a 2017 video next year and talk about all of those along with Nier Automata, Fire Emblem Echoes, Wolfenstein 2, and Prey, but we'll see. Truth be told, I don't think that 2016 is technically my absolute favorite year in gaming. I wish I could have made a video for the 20th anniversary of 2004, because I think that one edges it out just a little bit. But 2016 was, in general, a very important year in my life, and is hands down my favorite year in games when it comes to being an adult with my own expendable income. The ability to play new games as they were coming out and collect old ones from previous generations. Different people enjoy different kinds of games and derive value from their experiences with games in different ways. But for me personally, I can say with a fair degree of certainty that there won't be another year like 2016 for me ever again. There are a lot of reasons for this. Firstly, a lot of the franchises featured in this video were follow-ups to games that were from my formative years. Being a late teenager during the 7th gen and an adult in the 8th gen meant I had a lot more disposable free time to spend on games during the 7th gen and prior. So a lot of the times they left a more lasting impression because I got to spend more time with them. I was able to buy Dishonored and Pokemon Black and White 2 with my own money from working my first job. By the time Dishonored 2 and Pokemon Sun and Moon came out, I was a completely different person, but one who is extremely nostalgic for that previous era. Next is my relationship to games and collecting has changed drastically in the last decade, partially from choices I have made and partially from decisions that have been imposed upon me by shifts in the industry. I don't want to rehash a lot of the same points I made in the collecting video, but I'll go over a few briefly here. The 8th and 9th gen consoles have added a ton of functionality that actually obscures a thick layer of enshittification. Mandatory online connectivity, games not being fully included on the disc, long updates and download times, an excess of corporate greed from Sony and Nintendo that has seen consoles and game prices skyrocket with no real justification backed by quality. So as a result, I don't own any of the 9th gen consoles and I have zero plans of doing so. As a collector, I'm very concerned with long-term preservation. And if games are no longer going to come complete on disc or even be released physically at all in some cases, I will be a lot more selective of which ones I buy and will buy them exclusively on the Steam Deck. If it must be the case that a game requires an online service to work and exists only as a digital file on a cloud server, then there's no amount of FOMO that would make me impulse buy a game or pay full price for it. I'm happy to wait for sales, and luckily I'm not that big of a fan of online multiplayer games these days as well. So since there is a clear beginning point and end point to which games my physical collection can include, my collection, and by extension the potential size of my backlog, is nearing its end. And to that I'm grateful. As much fun as I've had hunting for games and shopping around my local stores, I'm so much more looking forward to the years and years of old classics I'll finally be able to get around to finishing, as well as revisiting beloved games from years like 2016. But another reason why 2016 can't happen again for me personally is several of the franchises listed here today are either seemingly on permanent hiatus or unrecognizable from their former selves. Doom and Shantae are seemingly doing fine, but Dishonored, Deus Ex, and Titanfall are basically over. Mankind Divided failed to sell the desired 6 million copies, even though it sold multiple millions, and even though there was a draft for a continuation of the game internally referred to as MD2. The project was scrapped in early pre-production, and Eidos Montreal was disbanded. Just such a fucking shame from top to bottom. A bunch of devs just absolutely put through the ringer with everything they did, turned out a couple of great games, and still got the shaft. Elias Tufexis, the voice of Adam Jensen, made a very impassioned statement about this situation after it was announced, and this hit me like a punch to the gut to read. Dishonored 2 was followed up by an expansion called Death of the Outsider and 2 more books. 2017's Prey is an immersive sim worthy of Arkane's legacy, but unfortunately Dishonored 3 is nowhere to be found. Dishonored 2 is a very expensive game to make, and lots of news articles mock the fact that the game costs more than Skyrim and yet sold less, something that speaks nothing of the game's quality or polish. I think it's fair to say that the Microsoft purchase of Bethesda was a complete abject failure. Microsoft forced so many of Bethesda's own studios to pump out games they had no business making. While Arcane Lyon is probably going to be fine, Arcane Austin was shut down after Redfall failed, a game they frankly had no business making. Microsoft insisting they needed to make a multiplayer live service game because those are all the rage, regardless of the resume of the studio or what they even wanted to make. Similarly are the reasons why we still don't have a Titanfall 3. Respawn accidentally made an infinite money printing machine in Apex Legends, so there was very little incentive to make a big budget game with a single player campaign that people only had to pay for one time when you can squeeze money out of people forever with a live service model. Then there are some of the founding members of Respawn that left the company to make yet another studio. God, this sounds familiar. But what they ended up with was Highguard, and I don't even have to tell you how that went. So 2016 is a very special year for me, not only because I really love the games that released that year, but I also look back on it fondly with nostalgia, knowing I had it good, but not realizing how good I had it. But anyway, this was a really fun project. I enjoyed finally having a creative outlet to talk about some of the franchises that I otherwise have never been able to talk about in a video before, and I would love to be able to dedicate more time to them. I would love to do a retrospective on every id Tech game if I could, but far more likely it would be an immersive sim retrospective, as I have so much more to say about Deus Ex and Dishonored, but I'm not committing to that at the moment. It's on my list to one day do a retrospective on the Yomawari trilogy, though, so look forward to that whenever. In the meantime, hell or high water, the next video will be on Dragon Quest Heroes as the Muso retrospective finally continues. But this was a fun little distraction, and I didn't intend on making this when the year started, but when I realized 2016 was a decade ago, I just couldn't move on until I got the brainworms out, so till next time.